Hello and welcome to the 2024 MIFF Schools program. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all live, learn and work, and to pay respects to their elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. On behalf of MIFF, we believe in celebrating the history and contemporary creativity of the world's oldest living culture. As those of you familiar with MIFF Schools programs from previous years will no doubt already be aware, these presentations have been created as an educational resource for teachers and students, providing an overview of each film text, suggesting strategies for analysis and topics for classroom discussion, and tying together aspects from the film texts to the various assessment criteria found within the language courses offered under VCA, and to subjects such as English, EAL, Literature, Media Studies, and to the Film Study course for the International Baccalaureate. In each of those courses, there is this key focus on developing students' visual literacy skills and encouraging students to critically engage with media texts across a range of contexts. And this is obviously a key component of assessment as students progress into their final years of the VCE. And so for that reason, film analysis will be a key focus of these presentations, not necessarily as a replacement or a substitute for the focus on language and cultural aspects, but rather as something that can sit side by side those elements. While the MIFF Schools program is ideally suited to students within French, Japanese, Mandarin, Spanish, and German language courses, the selected films in this year's program offer opportunities for study and classroom analysis across a diverse range of subjects, abilities, and age groups, preparing students for text-based assessments and really developing those visual literacy skills. And so given the importance of visual literacy across a range of subjects, I'd recommend that prior to attending the screening, that teachers introduce or revise some key terminology and film techniques to outline the elements of the text that students should be thinking about while they're watching the film. Because, and I say this every year, it's crucially important to reinforce the need for students to actively engage with these films. Yes, they're entertaining, films are fun, but there's also an expectation that they'll be analysing those films, whether as part of a non-English language course or English, EAL, Media or Film Studies unit. I'll talk about some of these elements in relation to the specific film in more detail shortly, but a general overview of film techniques would be beneficial prior to the screening. And look, there's no shortage of film resources online that can assist in that process, whether on YouTube or in textbook form. But I would also emphasize from the outset that it's crucially important that students can first identify the technique, secondly, that they can understand its general function in creating meaning within the film, and thirdly, that they can apply that knowledge and that terminology to an analysis of the specific text in the context of the narrative, the characters, the themes and ideas that the film is exploring. And it's really difficult to achieve that final outcome unless the first two learning aims have been properly established and understood. And so with that in mind, some of the basic techniques and terminology that students should ideally be familiar with are things like cinematography, so the use, for example, of a close-up shot or a wide-angle shot, or camera movement, the various components of mise-en-scène, so basically everything that goes within the frame, the use of props, costumes, lighting, the blocking of actors, the composition of the frame, where relevant, things like music and lyrics, sound, dialogue, voiceover, the use of editing, narrative structure, the story elements within the narrative, and to things like visual motifs and symbolism. So as I mentioned, these basic building blocks of film language are really essential to establish pre-screening. And by setting these up prior to the screening, you're giving the students something to be on the lookout for while they're watching the film, rather than trying to work backwards after the screening, which is almost always less effective. And so depending on the age group or the academic level of the students, you could always assign individual students or groups of students with a particular technique or element of the film to be on the lookout for, to report back in the post-screening classroom discussion, so that they're not necessarily overwhelmed in attempting to look for everything all at once, especially if these are students who might not have a lot of experience with film analysis. Okay, so let's move on to looking at the film in more detail now. I should mention that this will be a relatively spoiler-free presentation. I'm going to avoid as much as possible giving away any crucial plot details or revelations within the film, while still providing an overview of aspects for analysis that might help structure classroom discussion. So, Moving is a Japanese coming-of-age film about an adolescent girl, Ren, or Renko, and her struggles to come to terms with the recent divorce of her parents, Nazuna and Kenichi. The film, which has been lovingly restored in 4K, actually released back in 1993, and it's been rarely seen outside of Japan in the years since, and the film's director sadly passed away in 2001. However, despite the 90s context, many of the film's themes and cultural issues remain entirely relevant today, and it has, arguably, one of the all-time great sequences towards the end of the film, which I'm not going to spoil for you. I know I'm supposed to be impartial, but I think this really is one of the standout selections in this year's festival. So just as an overview or a starting point, some of the key themes explored within Moving, things like coming of age, themes and issues to do with family, divorce, friendship, to gender expectations, to the idea of finding a sense of belonging or place, reconciling the past, and also elements of fantasy and imagination. And I'll touch on some of these as I go throughout the presentation in more detail. Now, when I approach a film text, I often like to start from the big picture and then gradually work in towards the detailed filmic analysis. And one of the reasons I do that is to really impress upon students this idea that film and art more generally isn't created in a vacuum. It responds to its own cultural and historical moment, whether deliberately or unconsciously. And there are a number of contexts that you could situate this film in, either before the screening or certainly afterwards, just to really develop students' understandings of the film's place in its broader cultural, historical moment. And there are a number of ways I think you could pursue this. So one would be just in terms of the geographic context in which the film takes place, in terms of Kyoto. So the regional specific elements that students may not be familiar with. Another might be the film's gender context. So looking at the place of women within Japan and the role of women traditionally and how that's perhaps changed even from, say, the 1990s when this film was made to a more contemporary context. Again, these are a number of avenues to pursue in terms of really illuminating what this film is discussing and how it's discussing it. Also, education in Japan. How does the educational system in Japan differ from, say, an Australian context? Again, another potential context that taps back into what we see Ren go through within the film, that students could perhaps benefit from having a greater awareness of in these cultural contexts. And lastly, I think a really important one is the issue of divorce, or the context of divorce, and what the sort of social stigmas surrounding divorce have been traditionally, say, going back to the 1990s, which the film taps into, towards a current era. How is divorce seen today? Or how does, again, to bring it back to an Australian context, what are the kinds of cultural differences between, say, divorce within Australia or other countries and Japan? Again, I think there are a number of avenues that you could pursue here. And I've listed some, Wikipedia links and one reference to an article in the Japan Times. Again, I would suggest these are springboards to wider resources. There's no shortage of articles out there that you could introduce within that classroom context. Another context that I think is often really beneficial for students is the production background. So looking at interviews with the director or his former associates and the wider critical or scholarly engagement with this film, I think would really enhance students' understandings of both the creative process and the creative intentions behind the film. And I always say this with a bit of a disclaimer. That is, what a writer or a director intended isn't the only way to understand a film, but I think having an awareness of what a director intended is a great springboard for discussion in terms of asking students, well, did the director's intentions come through while you were watching the film, or in hindsight, or how does having an awareness of what the director was intending shape our own interpretations of the film? And as I mentioned at the beginning, Shinji Somai sadly passed away in 2001. There are some interviews with him that are available online, and I've listed one of them there. And this is an excerpt from that interview where he talks about the significance of some of the elements within the story, including the location. And he says, "The story is set in the ancient capital of Kyoto. The double entendre of the people of Kyoto, whose words always carry a different meaning, and the distance they maintain with others are perfect for this story. There are more than enough stories about children who are affected by the lives of adults around them. How can I reach beyond this framework? It's fortunate if children can just enjoy their childhood, but unfortunately, they're often forced to live through their parents' divorce. But children can't choose their parents. How do children who get sucked into their parents' problems mend themselves? This is a story about Renko's discovery of herself. She tries to pave her own path into the future. She encounters the unknown and mentally empowers herself to keep facing the unknown. Embracing yourself doesn't mean you question why your parents gave birth to you. You have to find your own place in this world that you've been born into, like it or not. In this era, 1993, when children can't avoid confronting themselves, I very much look forward to how this movie is reflected in their eyes." Lots in that to unpack, the least of which is perhaps the regional specific elements of Kyoto. Again, that context I already mentioned. But you could look at this excerpt or the wider interview with Somai to start unpacking the film through the director's eyes or through people associated with the production. And Koji Enokido is Somai's longtime assistant director. And so I've listed a really great interview with him on the Ultra Dogme website, which again, I think opens the film up to even more interpretations and understandings. One other way you could approach this film is through the genre of the coming of age, the adolescent coming of age or family drama film, or indeed broader narratives dealing with divorce from a children's perspective. So asking the students to consider what are the kinds of films or TV shows that they might be familiar with that have dealt with this coming of age, this transitional moment in adolescence or teenhood. What are some of the points of connection, perhaps, between this film and those narratives that they're familiar with? Really trying to kind of connect with the students' own viewing experiences to link it back to this film. So what might be some of those similarities and differences between Moving and those films? What alternative insights do those texts offer? How does the cultural and historical context of 90s Japan shape our understanding of this film, through the lens of the coming-of-age drama? There's a number of similar or relevant films that you could draw on here, and here's another example of the broader scholarly response or critical response to this film, which I think would provide a valuable resource to opening up those understandings of the film. And this is from vis-a-vis-film.wordpress.com, where the author puts this film within its sort of generic context. And they write, "The family drama is one of the richest traditions in Japanese cinema. From I Was Born But to I Wish, they excel in showing us life in all its joys and disappointments from a child height's view of the world. But this is not an Ozu film or a Spielberg film. Moving combines the very best of both. A nuanced, intimate story emboldened by a Hollywood dynamism and visual flair." And again, I think the reference is there to both the Ozu film from the 1930s, I Was Born But, a very different type of film in terms of its historical setting, obviously, it's still set in Japan, but one where there's a number of resonances there in terms of children, in that case, two young brothers and how they view their father in this context. Or a film like I Wish, the Hirokazu Koreeda film from a decade or so ago, another really great film in that tradition of the family drama coming of age. And look, Spielberg's been obsessed with divorced parents and the children of divorce going all the way back to the beginning, but more recently a film like The Fabelmans, which deals with that more directly, would be another sort of point of comparison from a more contemporary Hollywood perspective. So let's look now at, I guess, more of the nuts and bolts of film analysis through those techniques and terminology that I mentioned earlier. So students really should have an understanding and an ability to identify some key basic techniques, like the close-up, where in this case we get this close-up shot of Ren or Renko directing her gaze at the camera. So there's not just a close-up in terms of that intimacy that's being fostered between the audience and her character, but almost an acknowledgement of the audience, that breaking the fourth wall, which we get at a couple of points within the film. But how does, say, the use of the close-up contrast to, say, the use of a wide-angle shot, where now we're removed from character, where you get to see the world or the setting in which they live, again emphasizing the importance of Kyoto potentially, or indeed seeing the character in a new light. Ren by herself staring up at the sky. What is this telling us about her character? Maybe a sense of isolation is being insinuated through the use of the wide-angle shot of her by herself in this big world. This is the coming-of-age moment, potentially. But other techniques include things like the high angle and the low angle. So when the camera films an actor from above looking down, that tends to dramatize a loss of power or a loss of status often. Or the use of a low angle shot where the camera looks up tends to exaggerate that character's sense of power or the status or the hierarchy between two characters, which is what I think is implicit within these particular examples. The high angle shot is Ren at one of her lowest moments within the film, and the low angle shows her sort of, I guess, her arrogance in this new relationship with her mother in the absence of her father, where she's trying to be the dominant force now. And there's a tension played out, not just between them through the dialogue, but clearly in terms of the visual composition, the angle that's being used. So what you really want students is to be able to have that ability to identify the technique, to understand its general function, but then be able to apply that knowledge to the specific contexts in which those techniques are being used. So some other techniques that students could be mindful of in terms of how filmmaking creates meaning through its various production elements beyond just dialogue. So things like lighting, obviously. And here we have a shot of Kenichi early on within the film sitting by himself in the dark. The lighting is clearly contributing to the mood. It's expressing his innermost thoughts or feelings, potentially, would be one interpretation. Or the use of camera focus. So in this case, we have a shot of Kenichi in the deep background and Nazuna in the front. She's slightly out of focus. He's in focus in the deep background. And the camera focus switches between them in this sequence. So again, suggesting that they're not on the same plane. They're at odds. There's a contrast that's being played out through the camera to emphasize this disparity between the two characters. Also, the use of handheld camera work at key moments, where again, it adds to that sense of immediacy or authenticity in that particular scene. The use of certain techniques that Somai uses in the transitions between scenes within the film. We often get these shots of the forest, or this greenery, or clouds and the sky. He breaks those transitions, frequently resort to the kind of natural world. And students should consider, well, how does that shape our understanding of the film and the characters and the world that he's creating? What is the significance of nature within the film more broadly, perhaps, to the characters and their journey or their coming of age, in the case of Ren? But composition more broadly. And if you look at this selection of shots down below, I think it gives you a good idea of the way in which Somai uses the camera to emphasize some of the kind of conflicts between characters within the film. Whether that's in the way he presents Ren in between her parents. Both literally and figuratively, she's caught in the middle between these characters. Or say in that second shot where we get the low angle shot of the camera looking up past Ren, who's slightly out of focus, to her father in the deep background up above her, framed within the frame in the window of his office building. Again, emphasizing this contrast or barrier between the two of them, and the fact that now, as he's had to take on an office job, their relationship has now fundamentally changed. Or the way the camera creates a sense of claustrophobia in that third image on the bottom line, where the characters are all in this space together, and how that contributes to the sort of the chaos of this scene, the crowding within the frame. Or indeed that final image, where Somai again uses this sort of screen in front of the old man to emphasize the contrast between these two worlds, the world of Ren and the future and the newness of the 90s youth, and the past and the traditions of the old world in a way. These are all elements that students could pick up on to link back to how the film is exploring character or themes or these ideas about culture through that visual language of cinema. Now, one of the things that Somai was renowned for as a director, was his use of the long take, or in Japanese, nagama washi. This emphasis on maintaining the camera's focus on the action or the actors without breaking or cutting away. So students should really consider what is the impact of the use of this long take as an audience in terms of our relationship to what's being depicted on screen. And his use of the long take is quite remarkable. This particular series of shots that I've selected are all from one long take that occurs sort of in the second half of the film. And if you notice just from those different compositions, the way the dynamic between Ren and her father shifts and changes throughout this scene, beginning with them on almost the same level, and then with Ren below and her father above, and then Ren closer towards the camera and her father in the deep background, and then Ren takes off. This all happens within this one take. So we get a sense of the ebbs and flows of their relationship, the conflicts that are being played out between father and daughter. By not breaking away, Somai's drawing us into this world and this conflict. There's another great resource that I think you could draw on to elaborate on Somai's use of the long take across his career, by Tim Deshomes, and he writes, "Typical of all these long takes is that Somai keeps his distance. Although his cinema is character-driven, he prefers the long shot to the close-up. A medium close-up is usually as close as the camera gets. Part of the explanation is that his teenagers, parents, or teachers express their emotions not only with their faces, but also, to a conspicuous extent, with their bodies. Somai's characters tend to show their feelings non-verbally, by suddenly changing their behaviour from walking to running, or from sitting to jumping or crawling on the floor. This change in bodily movement corresponds with emotional turmoil and benefits from continuous representation." That quote is entirely relevant to the way he presents characters in this film. Mise-en-scène is another really fundamental term within film analysis, and essentially it refers to all the elements that go within the frame. So from the lighting, the composition, the use of props or costumes, the blocking of actors. And what you'd ask students is, how do all those elements, working in tandem together, create meaning or convey meaning or shape our understanding of setting or the world of these characters? So here we have two contrasting examples of mise-en-scène. We have Ren's room in her Kyoto residence with its Western influences, and of course you have the childlike posters and objects within the room. How does that space, as it's visually constructed, create an understanding of her character? And how does that contrast to, say, a traditional space that we see later on within the film, and this elderly couple, a very different kind of space, which has its own set of meanings that are being played out through that visual design. So let's look at some of the themes in a little more detail here. So I mentioned family and divorce early on, and I think it's important for students to consider, how does the filmmaker represent these ideas related to the concept of family and to the social stigmas surrounding divorce in that period of 1990s era Japan? And in what ways does the film provide a sympathetic or an empathetic portrait of each of the characters involved? One of the things I really love about this film is that I don't think it plays clear favourites. It's not like the father's the bad guy, or the mother's the bad guy, or Ren's the bad guy. We understand over the course of the film each of their perspectives and their flaws as well. But there's a degree of irony in which this divorce and family scenario is established. We begin early on at this dinner table on Kenichi's last night within the household, and Ren stands up and says, "Plenty of fun table talks make a happy family home." Again, there's sort of that dripping in irony that this is anything but. And even if you look at the design of that table, we can see that they're all at different angles. So even the architectural design, again, within the mise-en-scène, reflects character conflict. But we get references to, Nazuna changing her surname back to her maiden name. We get this interesting contrast between, say, the divorce contract or the marriage contract and the new contract that is written up by Nazuna for Ren, that now this is the way things are going. This is our new contract. And we also see, through references to Ren's classmates, the social stigma around divorce. The children say about one of her classmates whose parents are divorced, her dad and mum aren't normal. And then, of course, she bonds with that classmate. My parents are getting divorced. too. There's also a great line in this film where Nazuna says, "Marriage means survival of the fittest." And I think that would be an ideal prompt for students to dig into, either in the context of the film or in broader social and cultural contexts. And in a way, this links us to the theme of gender roles. So in what ways does the film represent or attempt to question or subvert the expectations and responsibilities aligned with gender throughout the film? For example, the roles of carer or breadwinner, or the power hierarchies that exist between the genders in Japan. And a great example of that in terms of key scenes or sequences is when Ren spies a couple of family friends, one of whom might be pregnant, and she looks down at this and eavesdrops on this conversation. And again, thinking about the visual design and how this is presented, I think it's interesting to look at not just the dialogue where we get this sort of philosophical question about babies being born, amidst a scene where Somai is clearly playing with the sort of spatial dynamics and power hierarchies between men and women within the frame, where he's on top or she's standing above him, and then towards the end of the sequence, he's kneeling on his knees. So the theme of coming of age is really key. I mentioned this at the beginning, but in what ways is the film a coming of age? Not just for Renko, but for her parents also. How does the film signal their lack of maturity in terms of the parents or Ren, or the ways that Ren has had to become, perhaps reluctantly, the adult of the relationship in the wake of her parents' divorce? The father is moving out and he goes and gets drunk early on within the film in a park. And Ren turns up and says, "What's a grown-up doing in a place like this?" on the first night after the divorce. Nazuna has a little too much to drink, and again we have the similar composition with Ren standing over her, and there's a sense that, well, I'm the adult now. So these are all interesting things, and they're played out in a variety of ways. We see Ren doing the shopping. We have references back to this contract that exists between Ren and her mother. And as we see her tell her mother in a later stage of the film, "I'll be a grown-up as quickly as I can." So the film is exploring the kinds of pressures on children and the ways that they have to mature in the wake of things like the divorce or changing family situations. One of the other key attributes of Somai's filmmaking is this attention to visual motifs, especially those connected to nature or those elements. So rain and fire are two really predominant motifs throughout the film. And again, students could be asked to connect those back to or analyze them in relation to the various themes, ideas, or forms of cultural symbolism within the narrative. The opening shot of the film is a shot from inside the house through the window of rain. And moments later, we see Ren saying, "I wish the rainy season was over." So how is rain being used within the film? What is it sort of suggesting or adding to our understanding? Does it have a cultural element? Does it have an element in terms of coming of age, sort of an emotional content? Again, these are all questions for students to consider. And so too with fire. We have the accidental burning of family photographs at one point. We have a fire set off within the classroom. We have news reports that make reference to a series of suspicious fires within Kyoto at the backdrop of this family drama. And then within the festival, at the end of the film, fire again is a recurrent presence. The other key motifs that I think you could also have students be on the lookout for, or hopefully they will pick up as they're watching the film, are those of mirrors and running. So students should consider how the motif of mirrors, or reflections more generally, connect back to, say, the film's themes of identity, or duality, or this idea of the split that comes through divorce, or to maturity or social appearances, and also to the significance of Ren's running, which is repeated throughout the film. And if you think back to that quote I mentioned earlier on that long take slide, the author makes reference to running within that. And we see Ren running throughout this film in a number of key scenes. Again, what is that telling us about her character or her situation? For language courses or for classes looking to use this film for broader cultural analysis and study, there is plenty of elements in here to pick up on and develop further in that classroom. We have references to things like the home altar. I wasn't sure whether this was a Buddhist or a Shinto shrine, but either way, there's a clear connection back to cultural traditions. We also see Nazuna performing what I think is Tai Chi at one moment, or again, it might be a variation of Tai Chi. We have references to regional dialects and differences. Ren says to this friend, you're Jan at the end of the phrase. Can't you get rid of that Eastern dialect? This, again, is a nuance within the film that students would benefit from greater discussion. And in terms of, say, festivals, the Gozan no Okuribi, which I think is also called or referred to as the Daimonji from memory. Anyway, a fire festival, or a festival in Kyoto. Really interesting festival, and it's filmed beautifully within the film. Or indeed references to Kyoto and the city more broadly. But there's also references to food and customs related to food, to Lake Biwa, which I think is the largest lake on or in Honshu, and it forms the setting for the film's concluding stages, but also to sunflowers, which we see in the final stages of the film as well, which have a number of cultural resonances and symbolism attached to them. Now, without giving too much away, as I've already sort of flagged this in the introduction, the film has this remarkable sequence in Lake Biwa, which would provide ample material for classroom analysis. So here in this concluding sequence, Ren wanders around the surrounds of Lake Biwa against the backdrop of the festival. So students could consider the types of imagery, the pacing, the style or tone, and the various meanings or symbolism that's associated with the sequence, and what they all reflect about Ren's journey over the course of the film. And this is a great quote, I think, from Koji Enokido, and this is from the interview I mentioned on that earlier slide, and certainly one that I think is relevant to sequences like the Lake Biwa one in the film. And without giving anything away, the ending or the concluding imagery within the film. So students could consider the creative choices that are made regarding the ending and the concluding imagery. What impression might the director be attempting to leave us with? What does the ending suggest about Ren's and her parents' future? Does the ending offer a sense of resolution, or are there ambiguities? Is it more open-ended? Lots to unpack within those final sequences. And lastly, I guess sort of bringing all of this back together in the form of assessment. I know something that's been popular within language courses in the past has been to encourage students to read and critically engage with published reviews of the film, and then respond by writing their own, either in, say, Japanese or in English, drawing on their close analysis of the film and utilizing the kinds of terminology that I've made reference to throughout this presentation. And here we have an excerpt from one particular review of Moving by Dan Romaskanu, who writes, "Although the setting of the story is that of a large city in modern Japan with its houses and schools, there's an element of tradition and even magic that accompanies the story and which at one point becomes dominant. Fire marks several key moments, whether it's a way to express the outburst of teenage rebellion or it's the centerpiece of a traditional celebration that ends with a spectacular burning of dragon-decorated ships on a lake. Towards the end of the film, Renko will go through a horror-tinged initiation and transformation experience that may be real, may be dreamlike, is certainly magical. Not everything is explained. Some of the meanings might be clearer to those connoisseurs of Japanese lore, but even for the uninitiated viewer, the ending has exceptional visual and emotional power." This review is quite a good one, which is why I've left a link to that there, and to another useful link on the Japan on Film website as well. And with that, we have reached the end of the presentation. For information regarding bookings, age suitability, or additional details for all of the films in this year's MIFF Schools program, just head on over to miff.com.au/schools, and you will find all the information and resources, as well as links to the rest of this year's festival program and screenings. And so on behalf of myself, Josh Nelson, and MIFF Schools programmer Kate Fitzpatrick, we'd like to thank you for watching this presentation and to wish you a very pleasurable and educationally productive viewing at this year's festival. Thanks so much.